connecting. Okay, so before we start as well, I would just like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people tonight. I would like to recognise the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land and waters on which Nillumbik is located, and also where I am currently. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also extend that respect to all First Nations people. I would also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Dr. Jacinta Humphrey. So Jacinta's going to be running the session for us this evening. Jacinta is an urban ecologist and a postdoctoral researcher with the ICON Science Group at RMIT. Her work explores biodiversity-sensitive urban design and aims to find opportunities to create and enhance habitat for wildlife in residential neighbourhoods, urban parks, schoolyards and private gardens. She also monitors the Birrarung Trial Floating Wetlands, a series of artificial habitat islands installed in the Yarra River, so the Birrarung, and that's on behalf of Melbourne Uni. I'm sure that she can speak about that more as well. So I might pass over to you, Jacinta, to talk to everyone tonight. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online tonight and giving up your Thursday evening to hear a bit about the birds that share our suburbs. So tonight I'm going to be giving what is a fairly quick overview of my PhD project, which I completed at La Trobe University late last year. And it was all about how we can improve habitat for native birds in urban areas. So in the places where we live, we work and we play. As I'm sure many of you are aware, across the globe, the human population is continually increasing. And we recently passed a major milestone of having 8 billion people living on this planet for the first time in our history. And in developed nations like Australia, most of this population growth is occurring in and around cities, and this is resulting in urbanisation. So urbanisation is just a fancy way of saying that our cities are growing more and more busy and bigger over time. And what we tend to see is that it results in large areas of native vegetation being cleared to make way for more houses, shops, roads, and other kinds of man-made structures. So we end up going from a lovely green environment like the one on the left here to the photo you can see on the right, where everything is very impervious and grey. So as you might expect, this is a massive threat to biodiversity, both here in Australia and indeed worldwide. And it is a big problem for many of the birds that are trying to live in our cities. So for the birds that do stick around and co-occur in our suburbs, they have to deal with a whole range of different threats and challenges. And these include things like ongoing habitat clearing to make way for new roads. So some of you may be familiar with where this photo is taken. This is actually the Northeast Link when the clearing was occurring around, I don't know, a year and a half ago. They're also dealing with other threats like noise from our traffic and our machinery. We have problems with urban heat, and increasingly we're seeing issues with climate change in cities. Artificial light at night is also an emerging threat for birds and other wildlife. So if you're a bird that's trying to sleep at nighttime, it can be quite difficult if we now have lots of lights that are turned on all around our parks and our gardens. We obviously have issues with animals being hit by cars in and around cities. There's problems with predation from cats and foxes. We've got issues with pollution and litter, and of course, everyday disturbances from people. So there's a lot going on in cities that birds need to deal with. So it's not surprising to learn that research across Australia has shown that many of our native birds are now disappearing from our cities and our suburbs. The good news is local councils like Nillumbik are increasingly interested in trying to restore and enhance habitat for birds, and private residents all across the country are really keen to participate in wildlife-friendly gardening programs, all in an effort to try and attract these kinds of species back to our local parks and gardens. But the big question is how? How can we best do that, given all the different threats that our birds are facing? And this is very much what my PhD was trying to answer. What makes a suburb suitable for native birds? Or how can we make our suburbs more suitable? And in my PhD, there were two different things that I focused on. And these were the amount of housing cover and the amount of tree cover within a residential suburb. So if you think of Melbourne, we've got some suburbs that are really heavily developed. They've got lots and lots of houses that are packed in close together. So they would have a very high housing cover or high housing density. Whereas other suburbs, perhaps out towards the edge of our city, we've got much larger block sizes, less land that's covered by houses. So that would be much lower housing cover. And we see the same kind of variation with the amount of tree cover. So places like Nillumbik are incredibly lucky. You guys have a really high amount of canopy tree cover compared to other regions of Greater Melbourne, where we've seen quite a lot of clearing and there isn't much tree cover remaining. So I wanted to understand how our native birds are kind of dealing with change with the amount of housing cover and the amount of tree cover in our suburbs. And tonight I'm going to talk about how these two different variables influence four different measures of the bird community. So firstly, how does it influence individual bird species? How do they influence overall bird diversity or the number of different species that are occurring together in a residential suburb? The community composition of birds or the different species of birds that will frequently co-occur together within a suburb. And then finally, I'm going to touch on the occurrence and diversity of what I'm calling bush birds. So these are birds that would be traditionally found in patches of forests or woodland habitats. They don't do very well with changes in their environment. So they were a group that I chose to focus on specifically, but I'll talk more about them later on. So my PhD research involved going out to suburbs in Melbourne and conducting a whole heap of bird surveys. And this is an example of one of the suburbs that I visited. So this is actually Burwood over in the east near Deakin University. And each of these little yellow dots represents a single survey site. So I had 10 survey sites in each suburb. And you'll see from this aerial photo that most of those sites were located in residential streets. So I spent a lot of time standing out on footpaths or people's nature strips, looking and listening for birds in those streets. There's also a couple of sites in this example that are located along a creek line. So this is Gardeners Creek, I believe. And then there's also one site in an area of just an open parkland. So it's a space that's mostly just grass. We've got a couple of scattered trees, not much else going on. I also visited patches of native vegetation or bushland where they were available. Unfortunately, didn't have any in this particular example. So in total, I visited 30 different suburbs across Melbourne, and this map just shows you where I was focusing my research. So throughout kind of the northern and eastern suburbs, including areas up into Nillumbik. And these suburbs were selected to try and cover a really broad range of both housing cover and canopy tree cover, like I mentioned earlier. So the two suburbs that you can see closest to the CBD, those are Hawthorn and Kooyong. They're examples of really kind of high density suburbs with lots and lots of housing. They then extended as far north as Hurstbridge and then also as far east as Mount Evelyn. So at each of my 300 sites, I conducted 5 10-minute point count surveys. So that just means that I stood at a particular location for 10 minutes and I recorded all of the birds that I could see and hear within a 40-meter radius of where I was standing. And all of these surveys took place between September 2018 and December 2019. And in addition to going out and looking and listening for birds, I also collected some information on the different kinds of, I guess, properties of the suburbs I was visiting using aerial photos. So I've already mentioned that I looked at things like housing cover and canopy tree cover. But in addition to that, I was also looking at what proportion of the tree cover was made up of exotic versus native tree species. Because I had some areas that had quite a lot of pine trees and European trees. So we thought that perhaps birds might respond differently to those types of trees as opposed to native Australian eucalypts. I also looked at things like the amount of open parkland that was in each of my suburbs, if there were any creeps, and if we had patches of native vegetation, so those bushland reserves, if we had any, both within the suburb and also the surrounding area. So this is what my bird surveys look like. This is me out on a particularly cold Melbourne morning. So around my neck there, I've got a stopwatch so I can time my 10 minutes. And then I was just noting down by hand any birds that I could see and hear in the area around me. So what did I find? There were 8 species that were particularly widespread across the suburbs of Melbourne that I was visiting. So these included the noisy myna, Australian magpie, the common or Indian myna, which is an exotic species, spotted dove, another exotic bird, the red wattlebird, little raven, rainbow lorikeet, and the grey butcherbird. So these 8 species were recorded in over 20% of my surveys. They turned up at more than 180 sites, and they were present in all 30 suburbs that I was visiting. So these particular birds are doing really, really well in the suburbs of Melbourne. They've found a way to make it work. They've adapted really well to the spaces that we have created in our city. But that's not necessarily true for all birds. So I'll now move on and talk about how different individual species were responding to both the amount of housing cover and the amount of tree cover in my suburbs. So once I finished all of my bird surveys, I had enough information to be able to look at 42 different bird species. And I found that 83% of those, or roughly 4 out of every 5 birds, showed a really clear response to either the amount of housing cover, the amount of tree cover, or a combination of the two. And as we might expect, responses to housing cover were typically negative. So what these graphs are showing here is the likelihood of a particular species occurring within a suburb against the amount of housing cover that we have in that suburb. So for both the crimson rosella on the left here, and then also the striated pardalote on the right, as we have more and more housing cover, we're seeing that these species are less likely to occur there. And our crimson rosella, they're kind of a bit more widespread. They'll still hang in there in these more developed suburbs, whereas our striated pardalote is much rarer and they disappear earlier on. So they're not really found at all after we go above, say, 20% housing cover. They just disappear completely. But when it came to tree cover, the responses that I found for individual birds were much more variable. So I've got another 2 examples here. On the left, we have the grey shrike thrush. And this bird had the kind of response that we expected to see. So as the amount of tree cover in a suburb increased, this bird was far more likely to occur there. So not really appearing until we get to, say, 50% tree cover. And then it shoots up and they're much more likely to be living there. But we also had some species like the bird on the right, the little wattlebird, which actually showed the opposite response. And they were less likely to occur in suburbs that had more tree cover, which was kind of interesting. So when it came to overall bird diversity, or the number of different species that are occurring within a suburb, once again, I found that a really high percentage of the variation in bird diversity that I observed across my 30 suburbs could be explained by the different kinds of properties that I was looking at. So what that means is that there were really clear relationships between the number of bird species in a suburb and particular variables. So there were two that were super important. The first one, again, was housing cover. So what this graph is showing here is the bird diversity per suburb, or the number of different species that I recorded in a suburb against the amount of housing cover. So as we might expect, as housing cover increases, we're seeing a pretty steady decline in the number of bird species that live there. It's dropping from something like 45 different native birds down to somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 species. So there's obviously some that just can't hang in there. They can't find the resources they need and they disappear from these suburbs. The other thing that was really important for the number of bird species I was recording was the extent or the amount of surrounding native vegetation. So this is kind of patches of bushland that are in the local area within 1 kilometre of where my suburb was located. So as we had more and more bushland, I was seeing a greater diversity of our bushbird species. These were the ones that are, typically found in areas of forest or woodland. So it's likely that they're spending most of their time in these patches of bushland, and then every now and then they're coming to visit neighbouring suburbs to check out people's gardens or whatever it might be. And the third thing that I'm going to talk about at this kind of scale of whole suburbs was the bird community composition. So I know that this graph is a little bit scary to look at. Don't worry about that. What I found for community composition was that the types of bird species I was seeing in a suburb changed quite considerably along different gradients of urbanization. So the community appeared to be influenced by three main things. The first one, again, was the amount of housing cover. So as we had more and more developed suburbs, we were seeing changes in the particular species that would be turning up together within a suburb. The same was true for different kinds of vegetation. So this is both the amount of tree cover and also any patches of native vegetation, both within the suburb and also the surrounding area. And then the third thing that appears to be influencing which birds turn up where were noisy miners, which is something that we were not expecting. But as we had areas with more and more noisy miners, we were finding different species of birds were occurring there, which was a really interesting result in my PhD. Now, when I looked into this in a bit more detail, we again decided to try and separate things based on all of the native species and then also what was going on for those bushbird species, because we knew that they were particularly, sensitive to changes in their environment. So what these two graphs show here is the average number of species I recorded in a suburb for suburbs that were classified as either low, medium, and high housing density. So on the left, we've got our native birds, and then on the right, we have just the bushbird species. So you'll see for the native birds, as we move from areas of low to medium to high housing density, we do have a slight decline in the average number of species. We're losing approximately 15% of our native birds as we move to more developed areas. But for our bushbird species on the right, for these guys, on average, we're losing 51% of the species diversity from as we move from an area that has low housing density to high housing density. So clearly these particular birds are just not coping with this kind of dramatic change. They're not able to find what they need in these more developed suburbs, so they're disappearing altogether. Okay, so I'll kind of do a very quick recap of where I was at this stage of my PhD, so you understand where we're heading next. But so far, I had established that housing cover was really, really important for local bird communities. We knew that it was having a negative influence on the occurrence of both individual bird species and also overall diversity of birds within a suburb. And it seemed to be kind of driving change in the composition of birds that would turn up in a particular suburb. We also knew that canopy tree cover was important for most native species, but not necessarily all of them. And again, it appeared to be influencing the composition of bird communities. And the same was true for patches of native vegetation. These were super important for our bushbird species, or the diversity of bushbirds rather. And we knew that the occurrence of bushland areas was also influencing the community composition. And finally, we knew that noisy miners were involved in this story as well. So at this point of my PhD, I decided that I wanted to kind of focus more on those bushbird species to understand what it is that they were responding to exactly. And I also wanted to know more about noisy miners and the role that they were playing in suburbs of Melbourne. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this evening. So for this part of my PhD, rather than thinking about an entire suburb, I wanted to zoom in to an individual site. So this might be a street, this might be your local park, the local creek, or a patch of bushland in a reserve somewhere nearby. And I wanted to try and understand what makes that particular site suitable for bushbird species. And for this, I focused on two different things. The first was the actual habitat that was available at that site. So this could be things like canopy trees, mid-story vegetation, or any kind of shrubs. And then also our friend, the noisy miner. I wanted to know whether the presence of more noisy miners was influencing bushbirds at these individual sites. Now, generally, people are pretty familiar with noisy miners, but I'll give you a quick recap just in case you're not quite sure which species I'm talking about here. So, a noisy miner is a native honey eater species. It does belong here in southeastern Australia. Sometimes people do get them confused with common or Indian miners, but these guys are the native ones. And described as being an edge specialist. So, what that means is prior to the development of Melbourne, for instance, noisy miners would have occurred around the edges of patches of forests and woodlands. And they really like these areas because they're able to perch up high in a gum tree and look out over their territory. And it's not super dense and full of shrubs, it's quite an open area. So it's easy for them to see everything. When it comes to honey eaters, these guys actually have a pretty varied diet. They don't just feed on nectar. They'll also feed on some insects. And one of the main things they eat is actually something called a lerp, which is a sugary casing that's produced by an insect called a psyllid. And these lerps will be stuck to gum leaves, often the leaves of river red gum trees. So you'll often see noisy miners jumping around from branch to branch, trying to peel these lerps off the leaves. Noisy miners are a really social bird. You rarely see them by themselves. They live in pretty tight-knit family groups, and they can be very territorial and aggressive. So they don't really like sharing space with anyone else. They kind of like to defend their patch. And in case you need a refresher, this is what they sound like. So they have a very repetitive, annoying call, which they love to make in other birds' faces. And in fact, not just birds. If you happen to be a dog owner, you've probably experienced them having a go at your dog down at the local park. They're also obviously very willing to attack each other. But what's quite unique to noisy miners is they don't just go after birds their own size. They will chase larger bird species, so things like laughing kookaburras or Australian magpies. And in some extreme cases, they will even go after very large birds like this wedge-tailed eagle. So this is a really unusual behavior. Generally, a bird will only kind of be aggressive towards something else that it perceives as a competitor, whereas it's certainly not competing with most of these animals on screen. It just doesn't want to share its territory with anybody else. So this kind of behavior isn't really an issue if you're a wedge-tailed eagle, because you're not at all intimidated by something as small as a noisy miner. But for some of our smaller bird species, this can be a really difficult thing to deal with, especially if it happens on a daily basis. So what I'm going to show you here is a really short clip from an ABC science program, which was aired a couple of years ago, which was called The Secret Life of Our Urban Birds. It was a program by Dr. Anne Jones on the ABC. And what happens in this clip is they actually have a taxidermied spotted pardalote. So this is a bird that's no longer alive. It's been stuffed. It's from a museum. It looks like that beautiful little thing in the bottom right-hand corner. And they attach this spotted pardalote to a branch using some wire. And then next to the spotted pardalote, they hang a little speaker, which is going to play spotted pardalote calls. So as far as the noisy miners are concerned, this is a real pardalote that's turned up in their territory. And this video just shows how they react when they find the pardalote.
Here we go. They'll probably just find it in a matter of seconds now.
Oh!
Oh.
Oh my God. Ah.
Oh. That's the end of the pardalote.
So I know sometimes that video isn't ideal when we play it over the internet, but as soon as they start playing those pardalote calls, a noisy miner turns up, figures out where it is, and then it calls in all of its friends, and they all descend on that bird together. And they start what's called a mobbing response. So they're kind of swooping it, and in some cases actually hitting it. So obviously, if this pardalote was still alive, it would be getting out of there as quickly as possible.
Here we go.
So this kind of behavior is perfectly natural for noisy miners. It's something that they've been doing, as far as we know, forever. And prior to the development of our cities, it wasn't really a problem. So if you remember, I said that noisy miners would naturally occur around the edges of patches of woodland or forest. So in this hypothetical little patch, our noisy miners would be hanging out somewhere like this, around the edges. So if you're a spotted pardalote, there's heaps of habitat that you can use in the middle of this patch where you'd never come into contact with noisy miners. So you can go about your business and not have any problems at all. But what's happened over time as we've built cities like Melbourne is these kind of patches of woodland have been developed, and we've had some clearing happen. People have started to build roads, people have started to build houses or shops or whatever it might be. And what ends up happening is that big patch of woodland has now been chopped up into little smaller bits or fragmented. And now everything is edge, everything is suitable habitat for our noisy miners. So in this situation, there's now very very few places where our spotted pardalotes can live, where they're not coming into contact with noisy miners all the time. And that's when it gets really, really hard for them to kind of make it work, because they're constantly being chased and harassed by these much larger birds. So if we steer back towards my PhD now that we've gone off on a little noisy miner tangent, during this part of my research, I'd done all my bird surveys, but I also needed to get some information about the actual habitat that was going on at each of my 300 sites. So I also did kind kind of a brief habitat assessment at each one, where I was estimating the percentage cover of a range of different things. So things like the amount of houses, the amount of grassy lawn at each site, shrubs, mid-story vegetation, and also canopy trees. Now, for the shrubs, the mid-story, and the canopy trees, I also estimated the proportion of each that was exotic or non-native vegetation. Unfortunately, I didn't have the botanical skill set to go around and identify all these individual plants, and it would have taken an enormously long time. So this was kind of our way of getting around that and saying, well, we just want to know whether or not these plants are native or exotic. And then at some of my sites, including places in Banyule and Nillumbik, there were a number of really big old eucalypt trees. So what were mostly river red gums. And I wanted to make sure I captured those in my habitat assessments as well. So if I had any of those large mature eucalypts at my sites, I also counted the total number of them. Okay, so I'm going to talk through my results now for this part of my PhD. So here in this figure, I'm going to have a series of things that bush birds or our woodland and forest birds were either really, really keen on or really didn't like. And then the same for noisy miners. So before I show you that, I'll just quickly draw your attention to the key. Anything that has a cross symbol is going to suggest there's a negative response. So what that means is bush birds would be less likely to occur when we have more of that particular habitat, for instance. Anything that has a tick symbol is going to suggest a positive response. So that particular habitat is really good for bush birds, and they're more likely to occur when we have that. Okay, so starting with our bush bird species on the left, these guys showed a positive response to the amount of canopy tree cover, mid-story cover, and shrub cover at a site. So they really wanted to see all three of these different vegetation types in a particular street, a park, wherever I may have been. Those three things were going to help make the habitat more suitable for them. They also didn't like having exotic trees. So whilst they like canopy tree cover, those canopy trees really need to be Australian native species. As soon as we had things like pine trees or other European trees, they were less likely to occur there. However, the strongest driver of bushbird diversity and then the occurrence of bushbirds happened to be noisy miners. So as soon as we had more noisy miners occurring in a particular street or in a parkland, I was much less likely to see bushbird species in that same location. So clearly our noisy miners are having an impact here of making things less suitable for our bushbird species and making it harder for them really to hang in there and persist in our suburbs. If we now have a look at the noisy miners on the right, these guys showed a strong positive response to the amount of canopy tree cover, and they were particularly keen on those big mature gum trees, which was really interesting. We were not expecting that. We were thinking that maybe those big trees were going to be important for bush birds. But I guess in hindsight, it does make sense because many of those trees were river red gums, so they likely had lots of food for noisy miners. Similar to the bushbirds, noisy miners, oh, sorry, before I get there, the good news was that noisy miners didn't like shrub cover. So as soon as we had more shrubs at a particular site, noisy miners were less likely to occur there. So this could be a way that we could try and make things slightly less suitable for them and more suitable for bushbird species. Similar to the bushbirds, they were not keen on having exotic trees either. So they really want to have native trees, most likely eucalyptus, because that's where their food is largely coming from. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky if we're trying to improve habitat for some of those more vulnerable birds, like our bushbird species, because we know that both bushbirds and noisy miners want to have more canopy trees, and they want those canopy trees to be native. And at the moment, there's lots of councils across Melbourne that are putting out what's called urban forest strategies. And often they're looking to increase the amount of native trees, which is fantastic. That's something that we definitely want to do. But we also need to be thinking about the other kinds of vegetation that we can put back into our cities. So these are things like mid-story and shrubs, because we know that they either have no effect on noisy miners, or they could even make things less suitable for noisy miners. So they're probably going to be the biggest wins if we're trying to help some of our native birds. So I'm going to quickly go through some of my, I guess, top recommendations for what we can be doing to help native birds in cities. The first few are kind of at that larger scale of thinking about whole suburbs and more geared towards local governments. And then I'll talk more about what we can all do in our own homes, in our own gardens. So the number one thing that local governments can do is make sure that we are protecting any existing patches of native vegetation in our suburbs. These areas are increasingly rare in residential parts of Melbourne, but we know that they're really, really important for bush birds, so we need to hang on to them. I didn't really talk about streams or creeks as much this evening, but our stream side areas are also really important, both for birds and many other groups of animals. So they kind of function as wildlife corridors, and they enable animals to safely move through the suburbs so they don't have to cross roads or come into contact with dogs or cats or other kind of threatening things. So it's super important that we're also thinking about trying to get more plants back into those areas and looking after these kind of creek areas to make sure that they do serve their purpose of kind of helping funnel things around safely. As I've already talked about, we definitely want to be increasing the amount of native tree cover, but I guess my caveat here is that we need to aim for a big diversity of species. So not just something like eucalypts, which are potentially going to benefit noisy miners. Let's go for some eucalypts, which let's also chuck in wattles and sheoaks and banksias and melaleucas and all kinds of things that are going to provide lots of different resources for birds. We can also think about trying to replant some areas in our open parks or our green spaces. So quite often our parklands in Melbourne, they might be a footy oval, they might be a big open space where dogs can run around, and that's really important. We still need to retain those types of areas, but then there can also be some open space that isn't really being used by anyone, and that's where we can actually think about trying to get some more ground cover or some more shrubs in. So this photo here is actually from Royal Park in the city, and they've kind of started to do this underneath some of their big old river red gums. They're adding in locally native kind of grasses and ground covers into spaces where they don't necessarily want people sitting or hanging out. So that's one way that you can do that. We can also run really cool events or webinars or whatever it is to try and help educate people and get them thinking about the other kinds of species that are living in our cities. Our cities are designed more or less just for us, but there's so many other things that are living here that we can also be providing habitat for. So this photo is from an event held in Banyule called Breakfast with the Birds. It's an awesome one. You should definitely come next year. And you can also contribute to things like citizen science, like the Aussie Bird Count, which happens in October every year. And I guess the final thing for local governments is that at some point down the track, we might need to think about noisy miners as being a threat. They are currently a protected species. They're native, so we certainly can't be culling them or doing anything like that at this stage. But I do think that things could change in the future if they continue on their current trajectory of just taking over whole areas and removing other bird species. In terms of what we can all do at home, if you are lucky enough to have any kind of mature trees, doesn't have to be anywhere near as big as this beautiful one here, please keep it. If your neighbor has any big mature trees, talk to them about looking after those trees and keeping them. They're incredibly important. Council can only do so much with planting in streets and parklands. We all have to play a role in trying to increase the amount of tree cover that we have in our suburbs, or retain it if you're lucky enough to already have it. But the big thing that we can do is think about what goes underneath those trees and try to get more shrubs and mid-story into our gardens, or potentially into our nature strips as well. So I know that Nillumbik is one of the councils in Greater Melbourne that is now allowing or encouraging people to plant out their nature strips. Nature strips in their current business as usual state are generally just a patch of exotic grass and maybe a tree. They're really not providing any habitat for most native birds. You're going to see maybe magpies, or a couple of other kind of more tolerant birds hanging out there, but they're not doing much else. Whereas this example here is from a street in Burwood, where people have gone to town and planted out indigenous, ground covers that are going to produce really lovely flowers. They're going to attract insects. They're doing so much more than what our lawn is doing. We can also think about connectivity. So what I mean by that is, if I'm a bird flying through a residential suburb, I don't really care where your property boundary starts and ends. All I'm going to see is areas of suitable habitat or unsuitable habitat. So we need to think about how our gardens connect to our neighbours' gardens, or maybe how they connect to the local park or the creek that's just down the road, because this is how birds are viewing our landscape. They're seeing different places that they can stop off and get some water or get something to eat. So we really need to think about the bigger picture of just your own little patch of garden. Now, these last two I haven't really talked about so much this evening, but if you're able to, you can provide additional resources for birds. So things like elevated bird baths are fantastic, especially as we come into summer. I say elevated because they should really be up off the ground. Lots of birds aren't comfortable coming down to ground level. So the higher we can make that water source, the better. But you want to try and position it somewhere where they've got somewhere that they can perch on a fence, or maybe on a shrub nearby, to kind of make sure the coast is clear before they fly out over the water to either drink or maybe land and bathe in it. We can also put up nest boxes if you have a tree or something suitable to attach it to. We can talk about nest boxes more if people have questions. And if, like me, you happen to own cats, super important that they're either contained indoors or in a secure outdoor enclosure. So this is one of my two cats. It's hard to see, but behind her there is some mesh netting. So she is in an outdoor enclosure. She can still go outside, get fresh air, enjoy the sun, but there's no way that she can come into contact with any birds. So towards the end of my PhD, I became increasingly aware that the results that I had found were important for bird conservation and for the ways that we think about designing and managing our cities. But no one was ever going to read my thesis because it was 300 pages long and it was very boring. So I worked with a graphic designer to produce a brochure. It's just 8 pages and it goes over most of what I talked about this evening. It's completely free. So if you would like a copy of it, just scan the QR code on screen or head to that little link there, and chuck in your name and your email address and I can send you a copy. So that brings me to the end of my presentation this evening. I just want to acknowledge my amazing PhD supervisors and the organisations who funded my work. And thanks also to Warren for inviting me along. I welcome everyone's questions.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Like there was lots of things that I could definitely relate to in that talk, Jacinta. So I guess if anyone has questions, I would encourage you to pop them in the chat, or you can come off mute if you'd like. But yes, if anyone has questions, we'll also pop a few links in the chat to some events that we have coming up that I guess link in with this talk. We have a couple of bird walks that we're running before the end of the year in Nillumbik, so you can come along to those. Warren, do you want to talk to those? I can pop them in the chat.
Yeah, we'll pop them in the chat. The link to the bird walks. We've got Lockie, I see here, who's our biodiversity officer, so he'll be leading those walks throughout during the weekdays at the moment. But you know, people interested, definitely keen to understand when and where people want to go. So we're always keen to do more sort of outdoor activities as well. So yeah, they'll be coming up later in November. They're up actually on Nillumbik's website and as well on the information there. But yeah, Laura's just popped those links into the chat. Jacinda, the first question that came to mind was the little wattle bird. Why do you think that had a negative response to tree
Yeah. Yeah, the little water bird is a weird one. So what we think is going on is that they're not necessarily fussed about the trees. They're more keen on where they can find food. So they're probably responding to places where we've got things like grevilleas or anything that has like those big showy flowers that's producing lots of nectar. That's really what they're after. They're less concerned about, do we have eucalypts, say, planted in our street? So I think that's what's going on with them, but it's a little tricky to know.
Yeah, I live in urban part of with Montana, so quite urban, and you know, little water birds around. We don't have many others, but it's always interesting that they're around the area, and yeah, assume that they've got the food resources they need. But
Yeah.
yeah, none. I don't know. I haven't seen any other questions pop up, but like larger bodied birds like magpies, currawongs, ravens seem to be doing quite well as well. And I guess my thought is always whether they're having a negative impact as well, you know, as long with noisy miners on the smaller bird populations. And if their numbers are increasing, is that something that you sort of saw in your research as well?
Yeah, so definitely larger birds tend to do better in cities. That's something that has been observed worldwide. In terms of whether they're influencing other smaller birds, it's not something that I looked at in particular, but definitely things like ravens and pied currawongs could be a problem. They will eat bird eggs or potentially very young chicks after they've hatched. Um, so yeah, they're potentially a threat. Probably less so magpies. Obviously, magpies can be super territorial at breeding time, but they're certainly not having that kind of impact all year round.
So, got a question. Are you happy to do a little talk on your thoughts on nest boxes?
Yeah, we can talk about nest boxes. So nest boxes are a tricky one because they're not perfect. They're never going to be as good as a natural tree hollow, which is a hole that forms in the trunk or the branch of a tree over time, generally in a eucalypt. They're kind of trying to mimic that setup, but they often don't have the best temperature. So they can get incredibly hot in summer and quite cold in winter, whereas when there's a hole actually in a live tree in particular, it's a bit better insulated. So they don't get too hot or too cold. They kind of stick to this nice good temperature all year round. So that can be a problem. And also what tends to happen is the types of species that will use nest boxes are often ones that are already doing really well in cities anyway. So they're birds or possums that are super tolerant. They're not too fussy about where they're going to nest. So they go, oh yeah, this lovely wooden box, that'll do. Whereas some of the ones that are a bit more sensitive and maybe the species that we really want to help, they're less likely to use nest boxes. So they can be good, but they're certainly not a perfect solution.
Thanks. Can you see the chat, or do you want me to read out? There's another question.
Yeah, no, I can see the chat, so I can see Sam's question.
Cool.
So Sam's saying that they have Banksias, clystemons, and a blueberry ash tree that the birds feed on, which is awesome. Do you recommend any others? So, in terms of planting things to feed birds, it's really going to depend on what it is that you're trying to attract. So whether you want, say, I don't know, rosellas that are going to come in and try to feed on seeds, or if you're looking for, things like musk lorikeets that are more going to go after, say, flowering gums. So my recommendation is just to go for as diverse as possible. So diversity in terms of species of plants, but also in terms of heights, in terms of are they producing, flowers or fruits, or are they going to provide habitat for insects? Because we also need to be thinking about that so that birds that feed on insects have something to eat. So that's what I would recommend. As much range of things as you possibly can.
I definitely agree with that. No other questions in the chat at the moment, but when you refer to the housing density, is that impervious surface? So like roof, when you're measuring that, is that basically roof cover in houses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was done by looking at aerial photos. So basically the amount of land that a single house takes up.
Yep. And does that include sheds, paving, verandas, everything, or is it just?
So it was just the house, like the structure of the house. So it wouldn't include, say, if someone had paved their backyard or if they had an enormous driveway or something like that. I did also measure impervious surface, which did include those kind of things, and they were really highly correlated. So that basically, if you have more houses, you have more of the driveway and the sheds and the paving as well.
Yeah. Good to know, because I mean, I guess that's one big thing we face, that people are having, larger outdoor areas, and you're losing garden space when you have those types of things as well. So
absolutely, yeah. Especially when we're like with new developments, if they're going in and subdividing, they're often going for, say, something that is low maintenance, and that might be paved. Which is it's a big loss. We are losing space for gardens and greenery.
Yep.
So Sam's got another question around having an open garden invites miners. If I plant shrubs to break it. Yes. So that's very much what I would suggest, Sam, is that having a garden that's, say, grass and maybe a couple of trees, that's just perfect habitat for noisy miners, especially if those trees are eucalypts. So if you can try and plant things underneath those trees, so whether that's low growing shrubs or shrubs that are getting up to, say, a meter and a half tall, that would be fantastic, because anything that makes it denser is going to make it harder for noisy miners to see their territory and defend their space. But then it also creates spaces for those smaller birds to actually hide or nest or, forage for food. So it's a win-win. Okay, excellent.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, I might sort of do a bit of a wrap up. I'll just pause the recording.